Hello and welcome to Engineering Ethics at NJIT. I'm your instructor Daniel Estrada, and this is the lecture video for Lesson 7 on ethical codes. As always, these lecture videos introduce the reading materials and the lesson themes. You can interact with all this material on the course website at canvas.njit.edu. Alright, this lesson will be a little bit different from other lessons. I don't have a set of readings that you're required to read and pick a topic to write about. Instead, you're going to have a specific writing assignment for Lesson 7, and that assignment is going to be drawn from the NSPE Code of Ethics and the Board of Ethical Review case studies. I'll ask you to select one of the case studies from the archive and to give it a thorough analysis. You'll have to do a similar case study for your quiz this week also. So in that sense, there's not going to be a lot of readings this week, and so it's sort of a short lesson, but the case studies are fun, and I hope you enjoy it. I'll talk a little bit more about the assignment requirements in a bit, but let's go ahead and just start by talking about the NSPE and the Code of Ethics. We've looked at the Code of Ethics a few times already, just briefly, especially the preamble and the fundamental canons. Let me just say a little bit more about the background here. So the NSPE is the Professional Engineering Society, and there's lots of comparable societies in other specific domains of engineering. The civil engineers have an association of civil engineers, and mechanical engineers and chemical engineers also have similar professional societies. And they all serve more or less the same function as a organization to advance the concerns of professional engineers of different kinds. They in particular form a civic function of interacting with government agencies, both to help set safety guidelines and policies. And so the NSPE works with all the states in the United States and has chapters throughout the country to work on local engineering issues. The NSPE engineers are also sometimes called in to evaluate cases of engineering standards or ethical violations. Government might appeal to NSPE and the board there in order to resolve public issues related to engineering, safety standards, ethical violations, and so on. If there are regulatory policies that are being imposed, it's usually done in coordination and dialogue with the NSPE and other engineering professional societies. Okay, so the NSPE has been around since the 30s. It was in 1946 in one of their member letters that they mail out to all their members. In 1946, they published a code of ethics, and it was sort of a draft code of ethics. It wasn't an official document at that time. And shortly after publishing, engineers had lots of questions about what the particular ethical codes meant, how to interpret them in various situations. So about a decade later, in 1954, the NSPE set up what it called the Board of Ethical Review. This is not a legal body with any official legal or regulatory capacity. Sorry, that was my cat. The Board of Ethical Review doesn't have any official authority. Their goal is to help explain the Code of Ethics to engineers and to help interpret it in specific cases. So what the Board of Ethical Review does is every year it compiles a list of about a dozen cases. These are hypothetical cases, but usually modeled on real situations, or at least informed by actual engineering scenarios. And the Board of Ethical Review takes these cases, gives a little summary. It refers to the particular codes in the Code of Ethics that are raised by that case. And then it gives an analysis for about 2 pages. It discusses the details of the case, different ways of interpreting it, different ethical principles and issues that might arise in that scenario. Another thing the Ethical Board of Review does that's very useful, I think, is it relates specific cases to other cases that it's considered in order to establish a body of precedent for how it addresses certain cases. So sort of like a court system. Although, again, the Board of Ethical Review has no legal authority. It's not actually trying cases and finding specific people guilty. However, let me go get my cat. He's jumping the box. Sorry about that. Board of Ethical Review has no legal or political authority directly, but in cases of ethical violations, or if someone is found guilty of some ethical violation, in those legal cases, they might refer to the Board of Ethical Review as the official standard or precedent in the professional, as an example of this professional precedent standards. So I think these case studies are important to read to get a sense of what the expectations are in engineering ethics. I think sometimes these cases are really interesting and surprising how the Board of Ethical Review decides. It's not that every one of these cases the participants are found guilty. There are some cases you might read, even where you expect that perhaps someone was guilty of some ethical violation, but where in fact the Board of Ethical Review decides that it wasn't in violation of the ethical code as they understand it. So these cases are surprising. There's lots of them. They do about a dozen a year, and they've done it since the 50s. I should also mention here that the Code of Ethics is, to some extent, a living document. It's been revised several times after being formally adopted in the 60s. There was a major revision in the 70s because prior to that, one of the stipulations in the Code of Ethics is that engineers should not engage in competitive bidding against each other. That competitive bidding between engineers drives down prices, and this hurts all engineers. And so there was previously a part of the Code of Ethics was that engineers should not engage in competitive bidding against each other. And in the 70s, the United States sued the NSPE over this part of the code, claiming that it amounted to a monopoly on engineers, that engineers could sort of fix prices without letting it be subject to market pressure. And so the U.S. sued the NSPE, and the U.S. won, and the NSPE was forced to change its operating practices to allow competitive bidding, and especially for competitive bidding over government contracts. So that's a pretty major revision, and for this reason, the codes of ethics, the case studies that we'll consider from the Board of Ethical Review will all be from 1980 or later, 1980 or more recently, because the ones before then might appeal to ethical codes that aren't really applied today. The Code of Ethics has been changed since the 70s. The last major revision, or the last maybe minor revision, was in 2007. In 2007, they added some things about environmental stewardship and so on. Let's actually look at the Code of Ethics. So again, we've looked at the preamble and the fundamental canons a few times already in class. That should not say the attendance word, I'm sorry. I should have revised that. If you saw an attendance word, that's not the correct attendance word. Yeah, here we go. So in the preamble and fundamental canons, you have the general picture of engineering and the importance of engineering ethics. As the NSPE sees it, what our professional duties are, and remember the most fundamental duty here is to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. Especially concern for the safety of the public is what drives a lot of the direction of the Code of Ethics. We did this maybe a little bit last time, but I want to one more time suggest that the preamble and the Code of Ethics and the fundamental canons all exemplify all of the ethical theories that we've already talked about. Consequentialism, you see here concern for consequences of actions. Deontology, you see here concern with basic ethical principles and rules for right action. And then virtue ethics, you see lots of pointing to certain virtues or excellences that engineers should aspire to. I don't know that I've read the preamble. Let me read this. Just the preamble one time. The preamble says, engineering is an important and learned profession. As members of this profession, engineers are expected to exhibit the highest standards of honesty and integrity. Engineering has a direct and vital impact on the quality of life for all people. Accordingly, the services provided by engineers require honesty, impartiality, fairness, and equity, and must be directed to the protection of the public health, safety, and welfare. Engineers must perform under a standard of professional behavior that requires adherence to the highest principles of ethical conduct. So I think just in that preamble, you see lots of appeals to consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics. Lots of statements of virtues like honesty and integrity. Safety, health, and welfare are also virtues. This appeal to the highest principles of ethical conduct and not just the minimal principles goes back to a lot of the integrity stuff that we talked about in the last lesson. There's also an appeal to deontology. Just the whole framing of this is things that engineers shall do as their fundamental professional duties is a deontological framing. There's also an appeal to consequentialism here, and I like this in the second sentence. It says, as members of this profession, in the third sentence, engineering has a direct and vital impact on the quality of life for all people. Accordingly, the services provided by engineers require honesty, impartiality, and fairness and equity, and must be dedicated to the protection of the public safety, health, and welfare. The idea here is that it's because engineering has such a direct and vital impact on the quality of life for all people that engineers should be held to these high standards. In other words, engineers have a lot of control over the consequences of these important social resources, and because of this important social responsibility, the important role that engineers play, there are all these special responsibilities, a higher standard of ethical conduct that engineers are expected to achieve. Again, these standards are going to be higher than the ethical standards that might apply in normal life. In normal life, maybe you can get away with certain things without being considered having done something wrong or being a bad person. But these are the engineering ethics, the Code of Ethics and the NSPE are not merely ethical standards for general life. They're ethical standards that apply to engineers, and these are higher standards than would apply in general circumstances because engineers have this special responsibility in virtue of their social role. So I don't want to read everything in the Code of Ethics, but I just want to point out a couple of things. Some of these we've already seen before. The way that the Code of Ethics is structured is that there's the 6 fundamental canons, and then each of these 6 canons forms one of these rules of practice. So the first canon, again, is engineers shall hold paramount to safety, health, and welfare, and so there's some explanation. A through F explains to some extent what they mean by hold paramount to safety, health, and welfare. As we've already seen a couple of lessons ago, these rules strongly encourage engineers to blow whistles when they feel that there's some threat to the public health, safety, and welfare, even when that requires going against maybe your employer or client's interests, right, or other such authorities may be appropriate. One thing I want to point out, I think I might have pointed this out before, but Rule 1D here, engineers shall not permit the use of their name or associate in business ventures with any person or firm that they believe is engaged in fraudulent or dishonest enterprise. So this is one of these examples of the higher standard of conduct on engineers. So the claim here is not only should you be honest and not be engaged in any fraudulent or dishonest enterprise, but you should also not associate with any business ventures that are engaged in fraudulent or dishonest enterprise. So you can imagine a situation where an engineer is working for a firm and that firm is engaged in some illegal activities, but those activities don't really have anything to do with what that engineer is doing. That engineer is doing all his work on the up and up. All his work is within the law and is perfectly legal and is perfectly fine. The engineer is not himself violating any ethical principles, but the firm that engineer works for is, if the company is violating ethical principles, the claim here is that the engineer should not associate themselves with any business that they believe is engaged in fraudulent or dishonest enterprise. So even though the engineer is not directly doing something dishonest, because they're associated with this other organization that is doing something dishonest, then that engineer is also violating the Code of Ethics. Again, in normal life, we usually don't think like this. If me and my friend, if my friend does something wrong, it's usually not the case that you blame me for it just because I know my friend, just because I'm friends with that person. I'm not usually responsible for what my friends do. But here, the engineers, the Engineering Code of Ethics is holding engineers to a higher standard. It's not enough that just you don't do anything wrong. It's also that you don't associate with anyone who is doing something wrong. Right. So if you continue to associate, if you continue to work for or collaborate with businesses that you know to be engaged in fraudulent or dishonest activity, then you are also doing something illegal, even if the particular work you're doing with that business is not illegal or unethical. So these are the kinds of things that the Code of Ethics points out. Let's go on to number 2. Engineers shall perform services only in their area of competence. So you shouldn't perform or present yourself as an engineer as an expert in areas that you're not an expert. You see this in all sorts of professional domains. People giving legal advice who aren't lawyers. There's an ethical responsibility to clarify that you're not a lawyer. maybe I should clarify here again that I'm not a lawyer, that I'm not giving you legal advice on how to understand the legal implications of these codes of ethics. I'm giving you philosophical advice on how to interpret the ethical perspective here. But this requirement that you work only in your area of competence can sometimes result in maybe situations of ethical conflict, especially because engineers aren't always directly involved with everything that their project oversees. So typically the engineer is the one who signs off on the forms. The engineer, the professional engineer with the license is the one that's responsible, and when they sign off on their forms, that's the sort of seal of approval of the person who's responsible. But it's not typically the engineer who's doing all the work. Engineers typically have technicians and other people who are doing the actual labor, and it's the engineer who's sort of overseeing that labor. It's important, first of all, that the engineer sort of has the competence to do that oversight, to know what's required and what to check out for as overseeing that project. But that doesn't always require that the engineer is an expert in everything that they're overseeing. Sometimes engineers are overseeing very big projects, and you can't be an expert in everything. So what the Code of Ethics 2C here says is that engineers may accept assignments and assume responsibility for coordination of an entire project and sign and seal the engineering documents for the entire project, provided that each technical segment is signed and sealed only by the qualified engineers who prepared the segment. So if you're an engineer, you can oversee a project where you're not technically an expert in all of the domains that are part of that project. And you can sign off on that project as long as you make sure that there is some technical expert who is signing off on those bits that require that technical expertise. So making sure that the technical competence lines up with the task, that the people who are engaged in the task are the ones who are technically competent to engage that task is important. It's not just part of technical mastery; it's part of the Code of Ethics here. So part 3, that engineers shall pursue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. Part of the, and our textbook goes over this as well, but part of the special obligation on engineers it involves the technical knowledge that engineers have. This is knowledge that the general public doesn't have, and engineers partly bear the special responsibility to share that knowledge in ways that are honest and objective. Like first of all, just obviously lying and deception are going to be against the Code of Ethics. But more generally, engineers are required to communicate with the public in ways that reflect good engineering practice. That engineers should be sort of good faith representatives of the engineering discipline. That you're not just representing your client or your employer or your firm, but that you're representing engineers generally, and that when engineers violate public trust, it harms all engineers, not just that engineer. Along these lines, so it's sometimes the case that a licensed engineer might be called on by the public, like by the media, for instance, as like a second opinion on some engineering issue. If there's like a bridge collapse, maybe the local news station calls local licensed engineers for comment. And the Code of Ethics makes clear that you're encouraged to engage the public and help broaden understanding, especially of engineering practice. So sometimes you can do this just as an engineer, but sometimes you're sent by your firm or your company to speak on behalf of some project that you're working on or the company's working on. And in these cases, you're not just speaking as a general engineer, and you're not just speaking on behalf of your technical knowledge, but you're also speaking as sort of a representative of your company, and that you're trying to advance your company's interests. And this can, in some cases, represent a conflict of interest, especially if your company is doing something that maybe you don't want to talk about publicly, or that people would be upset if you talked about publicly. So the Code of Ethics here makes clear that engineers should always, at all times, engage as a good faith agent and trustee of the public interest, to make it clear that as engineers, you have the public safety, health, and well-being in mind. Nevertheless, you can speak on behalf of companies, and you can speak in ways that advance the interests of private companies and private firms. There's nothing that prevents you from saying that, except, and the Code of Ethics makes this clear, that you have to say that you're speaking as a representative of some company, that you have entrenched interests, and that you're not just speaking as a technical professional. Right, so 3C here says, engineers shall issue no statements, criticisms, or arguments on technical matters that are inspired or paid for by interested parties, unless they have prefaced their comments by explicitly identifying the interested parties on whose behalf they are speaking, and by revealing the existence of any interests the engineers may have in the matters. Right. So if your company wants to pitch a new bridge and sends you on the local talk show circuit to talk about why building a new bridge is good, obviously that's in your company's interest to get that bridge built, to get the contract on that bridge. And so to some extent you might be upselling the importance of that bridge to serve your company's interests. And to some extent that's okay as long as you're not being deceptive and dishonest, and as long as you make that affiliation clear, as long as you say at the start that you're being paid for by your company to make these remarks. Then by disclosing those interests, you at least give the public some resources for making an informed decision about how to interpret what you say. Without disclosing those affiliations, you might be deceiving the public about whether your comments are genuinely informed by the facts or if they're more informed by the interests of your company. So just say when you're speaking on behalf of a company. For what it's worth, the only person that pays me is the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Four, engineers shall act for each employer and client as faithful agents and trustees. Again, this has to do with honesty and integrity. Here we have more discussion of potential conflicts of interest and the ethical requirement to sort of stay away from conflicts of interest. 4A says engineers shall disclose all known or potential conflicts of interest that could influence or appear to influence the judgment of the quality of their services. And this again points to this heightened obligation on engineers, not just that you have to do what's right, but that you have to go above and beyond simply doing what's right and also make it appear that you're doing what's right. Sometimes this is a little bit difficult. Isn't it enough that you just did the right thing, that you didn't break any rules? Well, the Engineering Code of Ethics makes clear that it's not enough to just do the right thing, but you also have to have the appearance of doing the right thing. If you're doing the right thing, but it looks like you're doing something really shady, then that could also harm the reputation and integrity of engineering as a profession. And so the Code of Ethics makes clear that you have an obligation not just to do the right thing, but to present yourself and make it clear that you're doing the right thing. An example of this is, as we already talked about with the with friendship, like if my friend is up to a lot of no good, if my friend is going around stealing, then the fact that I'm hanging around with that person reflects poorly, not just reflects poorly on me, but maybe suggests an ethical violation on my part. Right? The idea is that because I'm associating with this person who's known to be engaged in fraudulent or deceptive behavior, that also gives the appearance that perhaps I'm also engaged in deceptive or fraudulent behavior, and the Code of Ethics requires that I don't even give that appearance. This is more than ethics might reasonably require in normal everyday situations. For most people, if you're not doing anything wrong, even if someone suspects that you're doing something wrong, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that you're not doing something wrong. There's issues about whether you can prove it in a court of law or whatever. But if you're not doing anything illegal, then it's nobody's business how illegal it might look in general. But for engineers, it's not just enough to do the right thing. You have to do the right thing in a way that makes clear to everyone that you do the right thing. One example that I use in my classes to talk about this, so this is an engineering example, this is an example as a teacher, but I'm not allowed to accept gifts from students as a teacher. Because it might give the appearance that I'm taking those gifts in exchange for grading them favorably, for giving them A's. And I've had students explicitly ask me for better grades than they deserve, and to try to bribe me in various ways, figure out ways of giving me gifts in order to get better grades. This is not acceptable. It's not acceptable given the ethics of teachers. It's not acceptable given the policies of NJIT. I just can't accept gifts in exchange for grades. But it's not just enough to not accept the gifts in exchange for grades. They also can't appear to be accepting gifts in exchange for grades. So if students come to class on a regular basis, like if, for instance, if a student in my in-person classes comes every day and gives me an apple, maybe it's harmless. Maybe they're not asking for grades in return. But maybe other students in class see the regular gift giving, and maybe other students in class get the impression that that student is getting a grade, their grades inflated because they're bringing me an apple every day. And even though I'm not doing that, even though I'm not favoring that student because I'm getting apples, I have an obligation to the other students and really to the NJIT community to avoid even the impression that I'm that my grading policies are swayed by apples. So if students are giving me apples, I would have to turn them down. This might seem harsh. It seems like a harmless apple. It seems like an innocent gift. But the idea here is that the standards are higher than they are in normal situations, and this is why we have to think about these engineering ethics policies. So when the student gives me an apple, it might appear like a conflict of interest. Conflict of interest is when there are multiple interests at stake that are in tension with each other, and some professional is at risk for compromising their judgment because of these incentives, right? So I have an incentive to give fair grades to my students. This is the NJIT policy. This is what's required of teachers like me. So I have an obligation to give fair grades. But I also have an incentive, because I like apples, to treat the student who's giving me apples favorably. And so the incentive to treat that student favorably is in conflict with my general incentive to give fair grades. And it's that conflict of interest, or at least that appearance of a conflict, that I need to be wary of and that I need to avoid as a professional instructor. On the next slide I have Spiro Agnew, who you might remember as Nixon's VP. I think we've talked about him in a previous lesson. But Spiro Agnew was caught, and he resigned from vice president because he was caught giving out no-bid contracts to his friends. He had a lot of friends in the industry. He was vice president, so he also had access to a lot of government contracts, and he was able to fast-track them to his friends outside of the standard bidding practices of the time. This was straight-up illegal. The judge who eventually found him guilty of this called him morally obtuse. He was disbarred. He had his legal credentials stripped away. So this kind of stuff happens. It happens maybe more than we like, and one of the dangers here is that this stuff happens so often that it becomes part of the standard professional culture, and that we don't really think twice about it or push back against it when we see it. My grandfather, on my father's side, was an engineer. He designed tools for McDonnell Douglas and other aerospace engineering companies. He contracted for these companies and worked for them for a while. And I remember I was a little kid, this was in maybe the late 80s, early 90s, where he was explaining to me how his job worked, and he was explaining to me designing this tool, and then the contract for it. He would say he would bid something like 30 hours to do this project, to design this tool on like a CAD program. And then he'd say that the actual time it takes him to do the design is something more like 10 hours, but you bid 30 hours, he explained, partly to compensate for the education and training that went into your ability to build that tool. And then also because that's the standard practice. This is how these contracts are given out. Everybody inflates their actual hours. They don't actually work 10 hours. They don't actually work 30 hours. They work 10 hours. And anyone else who's bidding for that job is bidding 30 hours or more. So when he gets that contract, his 30-hour bid is within the norms and expectations of the people who are giving the contract. So he doesn't accurately report his hours. I'm not exactly sure if that's how things go today. My suspicion is that it's not how things go, and that this misreporting of hours, even if it was standard practice at the time, is a kind of ethical violation. It's just dishonesty. It's filling out paperwork incorrectly. So maybe my grandfather was guilty of a kind of ethical violation in inflating his hours. Maybe I take it that my grandfather was accurately reflecting the culture at the time. This is how his peers filled out their paperwork also. So I'm not sure that my grandfather was operating outside of the professional norms of his day. Nevertheless, it was a dishonest practice. This is how you misjudge the time and expense that goes into these projects. So this kind of honest reporting is important, and it's made explicit in these ethical codes. I'm skipping over a lot of the stuff here. I'm not going to read all of this. This is in the third section of professional obligations. The Code of Ethics lists several different kinds of ethical obligations that engineers have, from things like don't use the equipment of your employer without their permission. From using your association with a non-engineer corporation or partnership as a cloak for unethical acts. That an engineer who's working for some other non-engineering firm and is doing things that are unethical by the Code of Ethics for engineers, but then them saying that, oh, well, I'm not really acting as an engineer in this capacity, so you can't hold me to that Code of Ethics. That's the kind of things that's explicitly not allowed by the Code of Ethics. I put little boxes around interesting claims. This is the Code of Ethics. It's not very long. It's worth reading in its entirety. I encourage you to go through it in a little bit more detail on your own. But I'm going to go ahead and move on from the Code of Ethics and talk to you about the assignment that you're required to do for this lesson. So again, unlike previous assignments where you could pick and talk about whatever you want, for this lesson I want you to do something specific, which is go to the NSPE Board of Ethical Review and look at their case studies. Actually, let me show you what this looks like. Let me go ahead and go into the browser. The Board of Ethical Review at the NSPE website, if you go down here, this has the 2018 cases. It looks like there's 12 of them. And if you go here by year, you can go back to any case to the 50s. And each year has some dozen or so case studies that you can look at. Let me actually open up one of these cases. Let me go back to, say, 2009. I'm just randomly opening one of these documents. So it has the case study on the website, but I actually like going into the PDF where it's all laid out nicely. So here's the case study. This is the actual case, and you can see that it says Engineer A. It does name the company Supercom, but I think that's a fake company, and it just talks about Engineer A. So this is not a real case, or maybe based on a real case, but the specifics here are hypothetical. So this was not an actual legal decision where anyone got in trouble. This is just a hypothetical case to sort of lay out some situation of ethical concern to engineers. After laying out the case, it asks a question like, what Engineer A did was that ethical? It refers to the specific sections in the Code of Ethics that are relevant to this case. And then here's so there's lots of ethical codes that are relevant here. And then it gives some discussion for about 2 pages, talking about the details of the case, relating it to other cases, and so on. Then it gives some conclusion. Here it says specifically what the engineer's ethical obligations are in this situation. And then these are the engineers who were on the ethical board of review for this case. So it's a short little case study. There's a ton of these on the website. And your job, let me go back to the presentation. So your job for this lesson is to find one of these cases. I'm asking that you do it from 1980 to the present, so you're not using a more outdated version of the Code of Ethics. Make sure in your essay that you link to the case and provide a clickable link so I can go and check your resources and make sure you're not plagiarizing, whatever. And then your essay should be on the case that you select. The word requirements, 500 words as normal. That should say 500 words. I'm actually going to change that to say 500 words so that you don't get confused. here. So now it says 500 words. So as usual, you're going to do 500 words. You're going to leave 2 replies on other people's posts, just like as in any normal week. But in this case, your essay should be on the case study. So I want you to explain the case in your own words. Don't just copy and paste from the PDF, but explain the case in your own words. Explain the Board of Review's analysis of the case. Maybe explain the other case studies that they compare it to. And how they differ, and then explain why the board came to the decision it did. So that's part of your analysis. And then you should also independently evaluate the board's decision. Do you agree with the board? Do you disagree? Do you think that the considerations were right? Were there other facts that you think deserve more consideration? I'd also like you to consider whether you expect to encounter a case like this in your own career, or whether you think the case is plausible. What would you do in a situation like this? So in 500 words, sort of address the case, give it a full analysis. There will be another short case study in your quiz this week, so you're going to have to do a little bit more writing for your quiz, but there's no required readings to do a quiz from. If talking about the case study doesn't fill the 500 words, or you want to do more than that, you might also try to give the particular case an evaluation from one of the ethical theories that we've talked about, consequentialism, deontology, or virtue ethics. These ethical theories don't come up explicitly in the Code of Ethics, although the styles of reasoning certainly do. And so if you spot those kinds of reasoning considerations, or if you think that there's other theoretical contributions that these theories can make to the case study analysis, then please talk about the theories. I'm interested to see what you have to say. So what I'd like to do here, I've already talked a little bit about the Board of Ethical Review. So what I want to do now is just talk about a couple of these case studies. I just selected a couple at random, 90-4, and I think the other one I selected is 2003-3. I'd prefer if you didn't do either of these case studies for your own case study, so don't pick 90-4 or 2003-3. Otherwise, you can pick any other case study. These aren't special. I just sort of selected these at random when I made these slides a few years ago, and they work well enough to get a sense of how these case studies work. So let's just go through these case studies. The first one here is misrepresentation of firm staff. So the actual facts of the case is pretty brief. I'll just read it. Engineer X is employed by firm Y, a medium-sized engineering consulting firm controlled by engineer Z. Engineer X is one of the few engineers in firm Y with expertise in hydrology, but the firm's work in the field of hydrology does not constitute a significant percentage of the firm's work. Engineer X, an associate with the firm, gives 2 weeks' notice of her intention to move on to another firm. Thereafter, Engineer Z, a principal in firm Y, continues to distribute a brochure identifying Engineer X with an employee of the firm that continues to identify Engineer X as an employee of the firm and list Engineer X on the firm's resume. So in other words, Engineer X was part of this firm and then left the firm and gave her 2 weeks' notice. But the engineers also all over the brochures and literature from the firm describing what the firm can do. Engineer X is one of the only engineers at the firm who can do hydrology, and this literature talks about her ability to do hydrology. And so the worry here is whether this literature misrepresents the firm, because Engineer X is going away and the firm is not going to have that expertise on hydrology as part of their employees anymore. So the question raised by this case, was it ethical for Engineer Z to continue to represent Engineer X as an employee of firm Y under the circumstances described? Like, was it unethical to pass around these brochures that suggest that Engineer X is an employee of the firm when in fact they just gave their 2 weeks' notice? Another way to put this is, do engineering firms have an obligation to update their literature every time one of their engineers leaves? So it's maybe not the most important question in the world. It doesn't really have a lot to do with health and safety. The question here is really about deception, and the Code of Ethics that are referred to here are really about the deceptive practices. Are you acting as a good faith employee and trustee to your clients? This kind of stuff. So in the analysis, they go over a bunch of things, but one of the things they do is they compare the case to another case 83-1. So in 83-1, Engineer A was highlighted in the firm's promotional brochure as the key employee. And what the analysis here says is that in this 1983 case, for one thing, the engineer was contributing an important skill to the firm that was highlighted in their literature. And because that engineer was leaving, still advertising the firm as having that key employee was disingenuous. In the case that we're currently considering, though, hydrology is not a big part of the firm's caseload. It's not a big part of the firm's projects. And so the fact that Engineer X is leaving doesn't constitute significant deception in part of this literature. In the 1983 case, the Board of Ethical Review decided that there were deceptive motives that they were passing around the literature with that key employee displayed in order to oversell the qualifications and capacities of that firm. But they say in this case, Engineer Z doesn't really rest on Engineer X for their expertise, and so it's not the same kind of deceptive practice. It doesn't seem like they're trying to enhance the firm's qualifications for work. Moreover, the Board of Ethical Review here says that, okay, so look, correcting materials, brochures, and so on, it's important, but it also takes time. It's not something you can do right away. If the engineer just put in their 2 weeks notice, it might be unreasonable to expect immediately thereafter, especially for such a relatively unimportant engineer, that all of this literature is revised. What they suggest is that in these kinds of circumstances, maybe you print an errata sheet that you pass out with the literature so that issues corrections, or maybe you just go through the literature with white out and like change anything that needs to be changed. Maybe within a reasonable amount of time after the engineer leaves, this literature should be updated to reflect the current roster of the firm. But the case decides that so the question was it ethical for Engineer Z to continue to represent Engineer X as an employee of the firm Y under the circumstances described? And the result was that Engineer Z was not doing anything unethical by continuing to represent Engineer X in these circumstances, because these circumstances don't rest particularly on the skills of Engineer X, because it's sort of relatively after. It doesn't seem to constitute deceptive practices. So this is one of these cases where it seems like maybe something is wrong, maybe there's an unethical practice, but the Board of Ethical Review decides that this doesn't cross the line of ethics. This is not an example of unethical behavior. You might think it is, but in these specific circumstances, it's not. If Engineer X was more important, or being displayed in the literature is more important than in this case, or if there's other sorts of deceptive issues with how this literature is displayed, then maybe it does constitute an ethical violation, but in this particular case it doesn't. So maybe you're surprised by that. Part of the lesson here is that the Board of Ethical Review is not looking to find everyone guilty of ethical violations. It's not looking to sort of nickel and dime engineers for minor or relatively inconsequential infractions. This might, if we're going strictly by the letter of the law, the fact that the engineer put in their 2 weeks notice suggests that the literature is somewhat deceptive, but in this case it doesn't meet the level of ethical violation according to the Board of Ethical Review's analysis. Let's just do one more of these. These are fun, and I think if this were a slightly different class, we could spend a lot more time on just going through these case studies in the Board of Ethical Review. I think we could probably do a couple of weeks of this kind of activity, but we're only doing it this once, so let's enjoy it. So this is case 03-3. The facts of the case are as follows. So Engineer C is retained to perform an inspection of a private residence by owner X, who suspected that there's a structural problem involving the roof framing. Upon performing a cursory visual inspection, Engineer C concludes that there is indeed a structural deficiency because of past modifications to the roof shingles that added weight to the original structure that it was not designed to carry, thus overloading the original roof structure. So Engineer C advises owner X to make immediate repairs, and certainly before the next snowstorm, as any significant additional roof loads would likely lead to failure of the roof structure and potentially cause injury and loss of life. Engineer C offers to provide engineering services to design, prepare plans and specifications, and file the proposed paperwork to the municipal authorities for a reasonable fee. But owner X declines Engineer C's offer to provide the design services and advises Engineer C via email through owner X's attorney that Engineer C should have no further involvement in the project. And then several weeks pass, and Engineer C observes that no one has done anything to correct the structural deficiency in the roof. So, just in my own words again, so Engineer C performs a check on a private residence on their roof, and they decide that there's a concern that it does not meet code, it's not to specifications, and that there's a concern that in bad weather it could cause a safety hazard that could cause people to die. So there's a genuine concern for public safety. Let me actually clarify that. This is a private residence, so it's not a concern for public safety, but it is a concern for human safety. There's the potential that someone can be seriously hurt after a snowstorm where this roof collapses. So Engineer C explains all of this to the owner and explains furthermore what all the paperwork would be required and the new designs to fix the problem, and presents all this to the owner. But then the owner, through their attorney, says, "Okay, we're done. We're not going to do that thing." And the engineer has no further involvement in the project. But then the engineer drives by that place and sees that they haven't fixed anything later, and that maybe the snow's coming, and the Engineer C is worried that there's a safety concern here, right? So this is public welfare, there's a structural deficiency. And the question is, does Engineer C have an obligation to go further? Does the Engineer C have an obligation to do something about this potential safety consideration? The case tells us explicitly that there is a potential to cause injury and loss of life. The paramount concern for engineers is the safety, health, and welfare of the public. So what does this situation obligate the engineer to do? It's a good question. So in order to evaluate this case 03-3, the board considers a couple of other cases, in particular case 89-9. So in 89-9, let me go ahead and go through this case also. 89-9, it's similar but slightly different to the present case. In 89-9, Engineer A was partly responsible for developing the structural design, which involved unique and innovative techniques. Therefore, Engineer A was the creator of the circumstances that could lead to the potential structural failure. But in the present case, Engineer C is only performing an inspection and was not themselves responsible for that structural failure. So the fact that Engineer C in the present case was not the one who built those deficient designs changes the engineer's responsibility. If the engineer is directly responsible for the designs, then maybe they do have additional responsibility. But in this case, the engineer is not responsible for those designs directly, is just doing an inspection. And they made the results of that inspection known to the owner, so the owner is entirely fully informed about that safety risk. In this case, it's a private residence, whereas in the case 89-9, it was a large commercial building where that was in public use. So the fact that it was a large commercial building in public use and that a large segment of the public might be at risk from continued using that building in those conditions of structural deficiency changes the ethical situation here. So the fact that it's a big risk, the idea in the present case in 03-3, it's a private residence, and maybe only the owner and their immediate relations would be affected, and that owner has been fully informed of the risk involved. So The board recognizes that there is a safety issue. Merely informing the owner doesn't take away that safety concern. So there is some obligation to do something. Here in this paragraph, the case study says, so in summary, while it seems clear in this particular case that Engineer C is obligated to take some action on behalf of the public health, safety, and welfare, unlike in the situation of 89-9, the board is not of the view that the facts and circumstances require immediate reporting of the structural deficiencies to a public authority. From the facts, there does not appear to be an imminent threat or a threat. Therefore, a more deliberate approach would appear to be more reasonable method to resolve the situation. For example, Engineer C could meet with Owner X's attorney to explain the technical and safety issues involved, the potential harm that may result from the Owner X to Owner X and other parties, and possibly suggest the involvement of an independent consultant to perform a second opinion. So this is not a whistleblowing level situation. The board decides. The board decides that Engineer C does have an obligation to take further action, but it doesn't seem like the situation requires that further action requires the engineer to go to public authorities or to the police or regulators. In other words, to bring more legal attention to the issue. If it were a public situation, if the engineer were more directly responsible for those deficient plans, then maybe the engineer does have an obligation to fix those plans. But in this case, the engineer really has an obligation to the owner to make sure that the owner knows clearly what the risks involved are. If the attorney is telling the engineer that the owner doesn't want the engineer involved, then maybe the best that they can do, the review suggests, is to talk to the attorney. If the attorney is informed about those safety risks, and then also informs the owner, their client, then maybe that discharges the obligations on the engineer. Notice that the Board of Ethical Review does not suggest that Engineer C should go to the police, should go to public authorities. This is really just making sure that the safety risk here is fully understood. If the owner fully understands that risk and still doesn't want to do anything about it, I mean, it's their property and there's only so much you can do. If the engineer thinks that the risk there is big enough, if it's the kind of thing that people use, if they have some reason to believe that other people might be at risk, like if it's a barn on someone's property that teenagers use to drink at night, and the owner doesn't know this, but the engineer knows it, then maybe this is the kind of situation that requires bringing in more, maybe bringing in public authority, or at least going further. So again, the Board of Ethical Review here, it's not a wild sort of justice operation. It's not really thinking about what's in the absolute best interests of the public. The Board of Ethical Review here really is trying to consider not just the interests of the public, but also the interests of the engineer, the professional interests, the professional circumstances of that particular context, and sort of have a sort of complete professional understanding of how to evaluate these cases. Both of the cases that I just looked at, the people involved in the cases aren't examples of major ethical violations. There are some examples that the Board of Review goes over that are definitely major ethical violations. So look through the archive and find cases that you're interested in. I'm looking forward to see what you pull up. One last thing for this lesson is I've opened the extra credit assignments, at least the first extra credit assignment, which you can see at the bottom of Canvas. I put it at the very bottom underneath all the other modules. So if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see there's extra credit assignments. I believe this first one will be due in November. Oh, I'm sorry. In the fall, this is due in November. It'll be due in a couple of weeks, depending on what semester you're in. Check Canvas for due dates. There will be 2 of these extra credit assignments. These are independent of your attendance and other extra credit that you can get. These extra credit assignments will be worth 20 points, so that they can make up for about a quiz. If you missed a quiz or that kind of thing, if you've lost a couple of points in your essays, you can make it up with these extra credit assignments. So, and these 2 extra credit assignments, they're both essays, short essays. I want you to have them be about as long as a normal essay, so about 500 words. That shouldn't say Moodle, that should say Canvas, sorry. And your assignment for this first extra credit essay is, the title is The Ethics of Your Field. We've been talking about the NSPE and engineering ethics in general, sort of the most general kind of engineering. I know not every student in class is going to be a general purpose engineer. Some of you are, there's a lot of mechanical engineers in class, a lot of chemical engineers, some civil engineers, and I know there's a lot of students who take this class who aren't engineers at all. So this assignment is really for you to talk about how our general discussion of ethics applies to your specific field. Are there issues in your field that make your field slightly different from the general ethical discussion that we've been having? Are there case studies or historical events that really inform how your field looks at ethics? You might look at the particular ethical code from your field. Like as I said, the chemical engineers, mechanical engineers, and civil engineers all have their own ethical codes. The computer science and computer engineers, electrical engineers, they all have their own ethical codes. The ethical codes are mostly the same in broad strokes, but in details they might be different. So one of the things you can do for this assignment is just look to see if you can find differences. Look to see if you can find differences in emphasis. And again, you might want to talk about a few case studies specific to your field that might give a picture of how the particular ethical challenges that you expect to face in your career. If you don't really have a field, or you don't feel like you can claim a field yet, maybe pick a field that you're interested in. Maybe it's not your field exactly, but that you want to talk about. So this extra credit assignment we'll be doing a couple of weeks. I will actually let you turn it in until the very end of the semester for reduced credit, but there's a due date in a couple of weeks for full credit on this assignment. I'd like you to use full citations if you can. Share any personal experiences you have relevant to this as well. Okay, and that's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate you listening to me for the last hour. Good luck with this assignment, and I will see you next week.